my part of the presentation off. Hello, I am Jarrod, and I will be talking about the Green Revolution, and I will also be talking about comparing and contrasting the 1978 Iranian Revolution to the 2009 Green Revolution. But before I jump to the next slide, if you know me, I love public participation. So I have a question for all of you. What do you guys know about the 2009 Green Revolution? Nobody.
Oh, come on. I showed a video before about something. That should have resonated with people, right?
This is vague, but I think we mentioned it here earlier. The reason green is associated with it is because green is the unofficial color of Islam.
Okay.
So it's related to Islam.
Right. Next one.
Oh, is there something involved with the corruption with the elections?
Mm-hmm.
The majority of people felt like the leader that was sworn in didn't win the election.
Yes. Anton actually hit the nail right on the head. So, the 2009 Green Revolution was sparked by potential voter fraud. So, 2009 was an election year for our Iranian president, the Iranian presidency. And while there were four candidates, two of them had major influence in both eastern and western reaches of Iran. Specifically, the winner of the election, and please forgive me, I'm going to butcher these no matter how much I practice this, Mohammed Ahmadinejad and Mir Hussein Mousavi. You can see at the bottom right, that is Mir Hussein, and at the top right is Mohammed Ahmadinejad. It was supposed voter fraud, a very rigged election. When the results came out in June of 2009, Mohammed took about 64% of the vote, while Mir Hussein took about 27%. And the other two candidates split whatever was remaining. But Mir Hussein Mousavi had a very huge following, especially in the outskirts, mainly the borderlands of the state's Iran borders. But he had a huge following. And when Mohammed Ahmadinejad won, something wasn't right. So from June of 2009 to about February of 2010, protesters took to the streets to claim that President Ahmadinejad committed voter fraud and to prevent Mir Hussein Mousavi from taking the presidency. And it was but then again, all the revolutions we've covered in Iran is rather bloody. Protesters clashed with police a lot. Mousavi had a very huge following. It was very welcome. He really appealed to the young people. And as Professor Shorkin stated in his remarks, at the time, about 55 to 60% of the Iranian population was below the age of 30. And all this information comes from the Congressional Research Service in Washington, D.C. And his following created a lot of uptick. He was even before the presidential election, he was very well liked, he was very well versed. They thought this would be a very, very close election. So when Mohammed took the majority of the vote, protesters took to the streets. And I do have a video. So when the Green Movement first came into fruition, originally it started off as a democracy movement. And that is why it was so appealing to the young people. As Professor Shorkin said, the majority of the population was young and had very few ties to no ties to the Iranian Revolution. And eventually the election turned into a pro-democracy. Like Mir Hussein was a renowned reformist who wanted to introduce maybe not a full democracy transition, but at least introduce democratic elements into the Iranian government. And that is what turned into the Green Revolution, a decision to transform the government into a democracy. So with that, I'm going to move into the next section. I think this is very beneficial. If you have your textbooks, I highly encourage you to take them out and follow along in chapter 9. It will be handy more towards the end. but I wanted to compare and contrast what was the 1978 revolution and what was the 2009 Green Revolution. So, to start us off, for the record, all of my 1978 Iranian Revolution comes from Botanica. It's a very reliable source. It provided a lot of context into what it was. And then all of my 2009 Green Revolution information comes from a devout novelist and writer for the Foreign Affairs news website. So we already talked about, I'll kind of skim over the 1978 revolution scene. Brett has already talked about it, but the core of it was the government did not meet the needs of the people. The reason why an Islamic Republic was established is because the people felt, also during the time, the majority of the people were rather young, that the monarchy was not suiting their needs. And it was riddled with corruption, it was inefficient, like I said, it didn't meet the needs of the people. And some similarities to the 2009 Green Revolution, the people felt the government was not representing the people. Voter fraud was one of the highest allegations, and that is something that is very, very rarely talked about. It got so bad to the point that the president deemed it illegal to talk about the election results and voter fraud following the election in about December, November of 2009. So, and government corruption was a big thing. President Ahmadinejad wasn't exactly the most stable leader. He had, yes, he won an election, but it's like I said, the people didn't view him as he didn't represent the values, and he definitely had his friends in parliament, and also the Shah at the time, I do not recall his name, were, I don't want to say buddy-buddy, but they had a good working relationship, and the Shah was also not welcome, not liked during the 2009 Green Revolution. So, there are some similarities, and then just to keep going on, the end results of the 1978 Iranian Revolution was to overthrow the monarch and establish a religious republic, whereas the 2009 Green Revolution wanted an Iranian democracy, protect voters' rights, and more government accountability. So, when you compare the two messages, they are the same. They want to introduce government reform, while the two different reforms were various different. They had the same goal. So I'd argue that they are very similar. Now, this is where you want to follow along in the book. If you remember reading the section challenges from below, Iran is, for the record, Iran is considered a developing country according to the World Economic Situation and Prospects Council formed by the United Nations. It emphasizes three major points. Revolutionaries established themselves, a sizable portion of the population dedicated themselves to both revolutions, and they established the government must be incapable of suppressing the movement. While that does apply to the 1978 revolution, it does not in 2009, and when we talk about wrapping up our presentation. Both movements, if we're talking about them, they are very significant. I argue that they are, and the government, as both the video said, and from Brett and, sorry sir, I'm driving. Daniel, sorry, thank you. They're both sizable. They were very knowledgeable, and it's something that we're going to continue with moving forward. So, yeah. To wrap up, I got another question for you guys. Who knows what's going on? Okay, I guess it's a Wednesday. So
there are protests over petrol prices. I believe just recently some people were shot by the police using live ammunition.
Dennis?
I'm not sure how much this has to do with the revolution aspect, but I've heard that a lot of younger people in Iran seem to really like skateboarding, and some people take that as a sign that younger Iranians are actually starting to align themselves more with the West than
Okay.
the previous generation.
I've heard rumors about that.
The economy's still trying to recover from all of the sanctions that
Mm.
US has imposed.
Alright. So you guys, like I said earlier, hit the nail on the head. A lot of protests have been happening in Iran for about past 2 years, 2.5, depending on, and it really started in 2017, when Trump, the Shah and the president both blamed Trump when they reintroduced sanctions that, it really hit their economy. They're going through a really struggle economically, and then both unemployment has been running high, inflation has been steadily rising. It's not as too bad as it is right now, but it is projected to keep growing unless economic reform is introduced. But the main problem is high employment. About 7% of the entire country is unemployed, and the majority of that 7% is the population under 30. So you have very well educated students, youth movement essentially. And when you throw that with corruption allegations and now rising oil prices, it's really a very tenuous situation. So, let me ask you to wrap up my section, or my points. Do you guys think another revolution is on the horizon? Maybe? Something? Dennis?
I think it depends on how loyal the military is to the current regime.
Okay.
I think it depends on how involved people are that are secular and tied in with like religious supreme leaders as well.
Anybody else?
I think for a long time, the young people in Iran have been pushing for modernization
I agree.
and for Western ideals. And they've been repressed for a long time, and I think it's inevitable that it's going to happen sometime in the not too distant future.
Alright, you guys got anything?